guess I need to start this stream now. Yapped for 15 minutes.
Excuse me.
Yes.
What was considered the free will offering? You talked about that earlier.
Yes, a free will offering. Some of the peace offerings were, I guess you could say, contained within the free will offerings. Free will offerings were always voluntary. Sometimes they were offered just to obtain the favor of the Lord. For example, maybe there was a big decision coming up for a family, and they would want the Lord's favor in connection with trying to figure out this thing, and they would go, and it may have even involved a marriage or something of that nature. They would go and they would offer this free will offering to obtain the honor and the favor of the Lord, and they would offer that as a sacrifice. That was something that was free will. So there were many sacrifices like that.
Was it? I was trying to think atonement, but which was that?
The atonement for sins, that was also always a sin offering.
Sin offering.
Yeah, that was a burnt offering, and if we get that far today, surely we will. We'll talk about that a little bit. Okay, so in connection with Leviticus chapter 22, he continues what he started back in chapter 21 concerning the priest and some of the things that they were to do. I had hoped to kind of keep those chapters together because they do go together, but that's all right. This is be a good review for us as we talk about some of these things. But one of the very first things that he talks about in Leviticus chapter 22 is that the people, the priest in particular, were to be holy to the Lord. The following commands in this chapter were given to the priest to ensure their holiness before Jehovah. We have had the issue come up of Nadab and Abihu. We've talked about that and how they were unholy. They offered unholy fire before the Lord, and the Lord struck them down, smote them on the spot. We talked about all the ramifications of that. First of all, they took an office or took a responsibility that was not theirs. It belonged to the high priest. Secondly, both of them went in to the tabernacle to offer this blood and the fire and the incense. And that was not the procedure that was to be done. And lots of other things, in addition to the fact that they offered this unholy fire. And so there's nothing worse, what I'm saying all that for is to say, there's nothing worse than to have leadership or the priesthood that's not holy unto God. The same thing today in the church. If we have elders or other men that are in a position of leadership and they're not holy unto God, then that's a situation that's not good. So you can see how that would be discouraging not only to those that worship with them or follow after them, but it would be a bad example and cause them to sin as well, perhaps. But men often traditionalize and pervert worship that is observed regularly.
Yes.
Now, we're not going to talk about what all the denominations are doing and all that kind of stuff. What I'm going to talk about this morning is the things that we do week in and week out that we can traditionalize and pervert if we're not careful. For example, what immediately comes to mind would be the Lord's Supper. We could substitute something for the unleavened bread. We could substitute something for the fruit of the vine. And that would be a perversion, wouldn't it?
Yes.
And we could come before the table and prepare to partake of the Lord's Supper and say, well, this is what we do every Sunday. And that's why we're here. And while those two statements are true, that's not the proper attitude in regard to partaking of the Lord's Supper. We do come every Sunday and do that. And one of the main purposes for us being here is to partake of that. But we're not doing that for that reason. We're doing that to remember the death of the Lord. And that is far and above more important than all other things. And if we're doing that, if we're remembering the death of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And we're remembering his body that's being shed on the cross, his blood that's being shed on the cross. And we do that thinking about that event and recognizing what he has done for us. And how he has given himself, his body, his blood, so that we might be the only pure sacrifice, that we might have forgiveness of sins. That's the purpose for which we take the Lord's Supper. And so sometimes we can kind of let the importance of that, get to the back of our minds and just, say things really that we ought not be saying. So it's a very important, essential part of our worship together. Murphy.
There was a book written by the son of a gospel preacher called Radical Restoration, and he advocated making the Lord's Supper and combining it with a common meal. And Paul said, "What have you not houses to eat and to drink in? Or do you despise the church of God, shame and have not?" And he ridiculed the Lord's Supper with the term pinch the bread and sip.
Yeah.
Really disturbing.
That's not much of a revolution, is it?
No, it isn't. It's a perversion.
Yeah. And so while Moses is communing with the Lord, and the Lord's telling Moses, make sure that Aaron and his sons and all of his descendants who serve as the priest, make sure they're holy. Let's remember that as we observe the Lord's Supper, as we worship, and sometimes even the word observe, is kind of a connotation that knocks down the importance of that. I mean, here we are to partake of the feast that the Lord has prepared for us. Yes, Bill.
Were these priests that served inside the wall of the tabernacle, were they supposed to be without blemish?
Well, it would have been nice if they could have been, but they were human and just like we are, so they had to offer sacrifices for their own sins before they could offer sacrifice for sins of people. So,
like scars?
Oh yes, that's physically, yes.
Hot marks?
Yes, physically they were to be unblemished. I think, let's see, I don't remember if it was last Sunday or the week before, we talked about those that stood and sacrificed before the Lord as priests, that they couldn't be, I think one translation refers to them as humpbacked. They couldn't be humpbacked. They couldn't, have a issue with their legs, limping, or some kind of issue like that. And as you mentioned, some disfiguration of the flesh. And so they were to be of that nature. And those in Aaron's family that were of that nature, say for example, they were dwarfed or they were large, overly large as far as, there's a term for that, I can't remember what it is. But anyway, overly large, they couldn't serve either. And so those that were of Aaron's family like that, they could not be priests. They were set aside to do something else. And so there was still plenty of work to do. And we'll see that, especially as we get over into Numbers, where the people get ready to move out from Sinai. There was still plenty of work that was to be done other than that. Some of that work we don't see going on yet because they're just encamped. But when they go to move, and when they go to taking down the tabernacle and taking the outer fence around from the courtyard and all of that, then that's a lot of work. A lot of work. So they perhaps could have been involved in that. So let's make sure that we remember these things when we come to worship. And one of the issues that I have sometimes is that when we're singing, I lose track of the fact that I'm singing praises to God. And I may be singing, and I may be singing to the best of my ability, and or not. and my mind drifts off somewhere, and that's, you know, we're all capable of doing that, and so we need to, as best we can, keep our mind focused and directed on what we're doing. He told Aaron and his sons to abstain from eating the portion of sacrifices that belonged to them if they had an uncleanness. That should be they instead of there. And so if they had some type of uncleanness, and we talked about this, an issue of some sort, an issue of blood or something else of that nature, that they may have had some type of injury that would cause something like that, then they were not to partake of that portion of the sacrifice that belonged to them. Now, in regard to all of this work of sacrificing, the person just didn't bring an animal inside and the priest go over there and it fall dead, did he? He had to slit its throat, bleed it out, and all of that. Knives are involved in that kind of thing. You ever slipped and cut yourself doing something with a knife?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
So you can imagine that there would be those things that would come up. And so Jehovah's thinking about that or commanding Moses and Aaron to be mindful of that and to recognize that something could cause an issue there, and they needed to make sure that they didn't partake of that portion of the sacrifice that belonged to them. Because in doing so, really they're defiling the tabernacle. They're defiling the sanctuary. They're defiling the worship. And so all of this is very physical in nature, isn't it? Today ours is very spiritual in nature. And a lot of our battles go on up here. And so we have to be mindful about that. And so they would profane the holy name of Jehovah, as well as cause them to be cut off from before him if they did that. Now there were other things of uncleanness, such as leprosy, an issue that I mentioned earlier, touching anything dead, seed going from him, touching a creeping thing, eating a torn beast or one dead of natural causes caused the priest to be unclean. Now, in regard to the common people, I hate to use that word common in that regard, but in regard to the Israelites in general, they could eat an animal that had died of natural causes. They weren't to eat the torn beast. They could sell a torn beast to one of the nations, one of the heathen people, and that would be okay, but they couldn't partake of that. The priest could not eat of the holy things until pronounced clean, or depending upon the uncleanness, till he had bathed and evening had come. Some of those things were just, remedied in a day's time. Some of them took 7 days. Some of them took much longer. And so it just depended on the particular type of uncleanness. The limitations, as I mentioned, on eating holy things, we see here a stranger, a sojourner, or a hired servant of the priest could not partake of the holy things. Now there was a portion, as we mentioned, in the wave offering and some of the free will offerings. There was that portion that went to the priest. He could eat of that. In some cases, just the priest. In other cases, the priest and his family. So if he had a hired servant, if there was a sojourner living in his house, a stranger that had come through, they were not to partake of those holy things. Now, let's say, for example, here comes a stranger into the camp, and he obviously has been out for some time traveling, had nothing to eat, and he goes, where would the heathen naturally go? They would go to the religious leader, right, to have help. And so the priest then would direct him to someone else. He couldn't partake of what the priest received because the sojourner or the stranger was unclean. And so some of the others of the Israelites would have to take care of that issue. And that's an interesting thing that comes to mind. And so far as I know, we've never, as long as I've been here in the last 11 years, we've never had an issue like this come up. But I have been places where it has. We've got a stranger that comes in, needs help, and everybody directs him to the preacher. And And so here the preacher is faced with this, and I never, when I was in that position, I never minded talking with a person. Most of the time I helped out of my own pocket. I'm not trying to toot my own horn. I'm just saying, instead of us as Christians taking that responsibility on ourselves, we shift them off to someone else. Again, I have never seen that here. I hope I don't. But those types of things come up. But getting back to the Old Covenant, a purchased slave and or a person born in his house then could eat of those sacrifices. And under the old law, a purchased slave was much like a member of the family. In 7 years, he would be released so that he could go about his own business. So in many cases, he was like a person, a natural-born child. The priest's married daughter who had married a stranger, that is a non-Israelite, could not eat of those things. So here we're going to have, and I don't know when the priest would have a chance to do this really, we're going to have all our family in, and we're going to have a big meal. We're going to have a feast. We've been rationing some of these things that we've been eating up to this point in time. We're going to feed the family today. And here comes this daughter who has married a stranger, a foreigner, or a heathen. Well, what is the priest to do? He is to provide for her some other way. Or they are to provide for themselves. This is a lot like some of the issues that we come into when we have those in our own family that have been withdrawn from it. Cases where we just can't provide for them. But that was the case in regard to that. A priest's daughter who was widowed, that should be divorced without children and returned to her father's house to live there, was once again the daughter under her father's roof, and so she could eat of the holy things. No stranger was to eat thereof. If he did unknowingly, he was to replace the food or whatever he took with 20% extra. In our day and time, we call that interest. So the translation state an extra 1/5. So that's 20%. So replace 100% of what you took, and then 20% extra. And so how do you describe that? How do you tell the stranger that knows nothing about your laws about this? Well, someone has to say, most likely the priest, someone has to say, you are a stranger, we did not know, and you partook of these things, and our God, Jehovah, says you cannot do that, and you have to pay 20% extra. So those are situations, and we think today that we've got situations to deal with that nobody else has ever done before. But think about that. These are real life things that occurred during the Old Covenant time when the children of Israel were still God's people, and that had to be dealt with. Unblemished offerings. The Israelites, or those who were sojourners who lived with them, were to offer a male, unblemished bull, sheep, or goat. And so we've talked about these sacrifices. We've even reviewed some of them this morning. We knew before we came here this morning that we had discussed unblemished sacrifices. The Israelites knew that. But Jehovah sees the need to remind them about this. There's no account up until this point in time whether or not that had occurred where someone tried to offer a blemished animal. I don't know if it had or not. But here's a reminder for that. Those that are blind, those that are broken, those that are maimed, having a boil, having scurvy or scab, that's an unacceptable sacrifice. Some were acceptable for a free will offering, like an enlarged or dwarfed animal. But they weren't acceptable for any other type of sacrifice. George.
Well, as we've already mentioned not long ago, about after they got into the land and after the people that were allowed to go into the land had died off and such. Boy, things went downhill. In Malachi, it talks about how they gotten to, sacrifice blemished animals and things. We as human beings need to be reminded of everything.
You're right. We certainly do. And so, while we're reading this, we think, well, how could they take? I mean, isn't it obvious that they're taking an animal that's not acceptable to God and they're trying to offer this animal to Him? They know God's not going to accept that. But then today we come laden with sin and guilt, and we come to worship the Lord, and we do that week after week after week. And I'm speaking to myself as much as anyone. I do that week after week after week. How's God going to accept my sacrifice, my rendering my worship to Him? That's not unblemished, is it? All right, in connection with strangers or sojourners' animals, they were not to offer an animal that belonged to a foreigner, for it was considered unclean and blemished in the sight of Jehovah. Now, is not an animal, an animal, an animal? Not to the Lord, it's not.
He wanted the best.
He did want the best, but even if it was the best of the sojourners, even if the sojourner had a prized bull that was finer than all of the Israelites, it was still unclean to Jehovah because it was not of His people. It was not of His blessing. It was not of His providing.
It should be their sacrifices. The foreigner was not a child of His.
Right.
Even it had to be from them.
That's right.
Sacrifice. And a sacrifice is not just giving something. It's giving you the best, and that may be all you have, but that's what you gave.
Right. That's right. And so it's one of the things that I mentioned in this next paragraph here. A strange or heathen people that did not belong to Jehovah did not have suitable animals to offer unto Him because they were an unclean people. Even in animal husbandry and all of that, the nations did things differently than the Israelites did because they didn't have Jehovah guiding them. So those were things that were important to Him, that they had sacrifices that came from a clean people in His sight. All right, this is something really that I had not thought about, but I knew that a sacrifice could not be made of a very young animal. For example, one that had just been born. But, according to the scripture here, in Leviticus 22, it tells us that an animal that was 8 days old or older could be sacrificed. So a young bull, sheep, or goat must stay with its mother for 7 days after it is born before it was suitable to be offered on the 8th day. What else occurred on the 8th day in regard to the Israelites? Billy?
The little boys were circumcised.
Circumcision, that's right. The rite of circumcision was performed on the 8th day. And so here is a separation of time. A cow or a ewe and its young could not be killed on the same day. Let's say a poorer family only had a cow, and the cow had been bred maybe to a neighbor's bull, and then this calf came, and that's all they had to sacrifice. They couldn't sacrifice it on the same day. Now, there were many occasions where they had the opportunity to sacrifice 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. I recognize that there could have been a substitution made. Well, maybe that's all they had. You remember the widow and her 2 mites? That's all she had.
Right.
And so it had to be different days when those sacrifices could have been made. And certainly in that case, my example, illustration that I gave you, it would not have been done on the same day anyway. Jehovah was to be hallowed among His people. And Jehovah is still to be hallowed among his people. He is to be the preeminent one. His rule is the rule of all. It is the preeminent rule. What we want to substitute or want to push his rule aside and do what we want to do and what our rules are, what our mind says, that's not suitable. Never has been. All right, as we go to chapter 23 then, we talk about the appointed feast days of the Lord, and he says, these are the appointed feasts of the Lord that you shall proclaim as holy convocations. So what is a holy convocation? Remember?
For a holy purpose.
Okay, it is something for a holy purpose. It is in regard to the holy convocation that he's mentioned on a specific day. That is a day of worship to God. It is to be set aside as a day of worship. For example, in regard to Pentecost or the Feast of Tabernacles, the first day was to be a holy convocation, no work done. The eighth day was to be a holy convocation, no work done. So it was with many other things, the Feast of Unleavened Bread and all the other feasts where there's a holy convocation. It's not just simply talking about the whole feast, but it's talking about specific days. And so in chapter 23 of Leviticus, beginning with verse 1, the Lord spake again to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel, and say to them, The Lord's appointed times which you shall proclaim as holy convocations, my appointed times are these. And so then in verse 3 he goes on to say, For 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day there is a Sabbath of complete rest, a holy convocation. Any of your translations use a different phrase there. All say convocation. Okay. You shall not do any work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord in all your dwellings. Okay. So there were set feasts that the Israelites were to observe each year. Jehovah tells Moses that these feasts will have holy convocations or worship days, days set aside as a Sabbath. Just like each week, the feast involved a Sabbath. And so sometimes we read in the Gospels where it talks about there was a certain high day. This would be a day that would be a Sabbath day associated with one of the feasts that all the Israelite males may or may not have been required to go to Jerusalem. There were 3 that they were required to go to. First was Passover, and that Passover involved the week of unleavened bread. Second was the Feast of Tabernacles or Pentecost. And then the third was, what's the third? Anybody remember?
Well, I think one is the Feast of Ingathering.
That was harvest, yes. That's right. So Pentecost was first fruits, and then the Feast of Ingatherings or the harvest would have been the other. Thank you, Murphy. And so these all involve a Sabbath. On the first month of their year, and the 14th day, we've talked about this, and we talked about all the ramifications concerning it. This was Passover. At evening, the Passover feast began. Now, if you're going to eat the Passover feast that evening, you've got to make some preparation for that, don't you?
Yes.
And so on the 10th day of the month, they put up the animal, the lamb, Passover lamb that was to be eaten. And they fed it for those 4 days, prepared it, and then they partook of the feast on the evening of the 14th day. And so you remember this is the feast that Israel ate in haste just prior to leaving Egypt when they were in captivity. They were to eat this fully clothed, sandals on their feet, outer garments on, ready to go. It's kind of like one of those feasts where, you know, sometimes when y'all may not do this, I've done this in the past, but sometimes you got a meal prepared there and you got something that you got to do, you got to get out the door. And so you kind of stand around the table eating a little bit. That's kind of like what Passover was. They prepared to eat that in haste, being ready to go. And so the destroyer passed over the houses, Egyptians and the Israelites, and spared the Israelites because they had applied the blood to the door, the lintel, and they were prepared. So that's how they were to partake of Passover on the first day of the 14th day of the first month. The following day, the 15th day of the first month, on this day, the Feast of Unleavened Bread began. They were to partake of unleavened bread for 7 days. The first day and the 7th day were holy convocations. Now, if I understand this correctly, from what we find here in Leviticus 23, the Passover feast was to be centered around a holy convocation to the Lord. The 15th day, which began the unleavened bread feast, it was a holy day unto the Lord. And so these first feasts were very important. And as I got to looking, we're going to notice this in just a minute. When you look at Pentecost, it was only 7 weeks later. And so they were very busy during this time of the year. Not only were they observing Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread, but they were planting, they were getting their crops in the ground, and they had those first fruits coming out, and they were observing Pentecost, and so very busy folks during that particular time. The first and 7th day, as I mentioned, were holy convocations. They made an offering of fire to Jehovah for 7 days also. And then we come to Pentecost, 50 days later. The feast of Pentecost, or first fruits, was observed 50 days after the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So that's 7 sevens, or 7 weeks, plus a day. The sheaf of first fruits was brought to the priest the day after the Sabbath as a wave offering unto Jehovah. You know, we talked about this wave offering. The priest takes this sheaf and he waves that before Jehovah, and the indication is, now the scriptures do not tell us this, but the indication is in that wave offering that the priest is showing Jehovah to be over all the earth. The ruler, the commander, the sustainer, the provider for his people. So that wave offering, the priest is then lifting that up to Jehovah in praise and honor for all that he has done physically for the people. The burnt offering, the meal offering, and the drink offerings were also sacrificed. Yes, Bill?
During the Feast of Unleavened Bread, was unleavened bread all they ate for 7 days?
I don't know if that excluded all other foods or not. But I know that the bread that they ate had to be unleavened. So I can't say without doing some further study and review.
They were supposed to either remove leaven from their houses during this time.
That's right. That's right. No leaven even in the camp. So unleavened bread for sure. But I'm not sure about whether that's all they had or not.
Sure.
Yes.
I'm dying to ask this question. Is not the partaking of the communion considered a convocation?
It is, yes, absolutely.
Okay, it's a holy thing.
Yes.
Absolutely.
We don't just come here just to meet together. We're here to have a convocation, assembly of God's people.
Yes, and that's why 1 Corinthians chapter 11, I don't know, somewhere around verse 28 or somewhere down in there, specifically states that if we eat improperly,
Yeah, that's
then we are bringing, retribution upon ourselves.
Yeah. Okay.
Murphy, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, in addition to them not having, anything with yeast, they're also not to have any honey.
Okay. No honey either. Okay. Yeah, and oftentimes they had honey with their bread.
Okay.
Honey's a good thing.
It is, yeah. It's a very, very good thing. It's a healthy thing too. While we're turning to Romans chapter 11, let's go ahead and turn over there, Romans chapter 11. The psalmist, and also the wise man in Proverbs talks about honey. And honey's mentioned a good bit in the Old Covenant, and the scriptures are compared to that from the standpoint that it is good for the soul. We sing a song, it's taken from Psalm 119, that mentions that as well. All right, in regard to the sanctification of these priests and people during the sacrifices, I wanted to look at Romans 11, verse 16. The wave offering sanctified the whole harvest. And so when they brought that first sheaf to the priest, and he performed a wave offering, and that sanctified that whole harvest. They were actually giving God the praise for the harvest that he had given them. And so in verse 16 of Romans 11, and if the first piece of dough be holy, the lump is also. And if the root be holy, the branches are too. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you being a wild olive were grafted in among them, and became partaker with them of the rich root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches, but if you are arrogant, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. And so here's the idea of us being grafted in as children of God. Those of us that were heathen beforehand were grafted in through the grace of God and his Son Jesus and the sacrifice. But I wanted to mention that in connection with what we're talking about here. We're the harvest. The world is the harvest. And as we are grafted into God's kingdom, then we are not to be arrogant and rail or be arrogant against the branches or the root which supports us. Yes, George?
Well, you look back at in Acts where when Peter had his vision about the sheep being let down with all these animals and everything, he tells God, I've never protected of anything unholy against you. Well, things have changed, Peter.
Yes, that's right.
I have made the Gentiles holy if they follow me.
Right. And so in connection with the first fruits and the sacrifice and the holy days in connection with Pentecost or the Feast of First Fruits, it's no surprise that our Lord was raised from the dead at this same time, that the first fruits of the harvest were honored, because he was the first fruit of the new kingdom. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 20, the passage states, but now Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who are asleep. For since by a man came death, by a man also came the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ all shall be made alive. And so Jesus Christ raised from the dead to be the first fruits of the new kingdom. And so a lot of connection here in terminology, not so much from the standpoint of literal connection, but figurative connection in that Jesus was the first fruit. Sacrifices on the day of or the Feast of Pentecost, or Ingathering. I'm sorry, not Ingathering. First fruits. I'll get it right in a minute. 2 wave loaves of leavened bread were used. And so in this particular feast, leavened bread was to be used. And so this is kind of a new thing. It is in connection. Remember now, we're feasting, or the children of Israel were feasting and observing these sacrifices to God in connection with the first fruits. And so the first fruits, this was a time of rejoicing. And this time of rejoicing would include leavened bread. 7 yearling lambs without blemish were offered, 1 young bullock, 2 rams with their meat, meal, and drink offerings were offered. 1 male goat for a peace offering was offered, in addition to the day's sacrifices. The lamb in the morning, the lamb in the evening, and whatever else had to be offered to make one clean on that occasion. In the 7th month, on the first day, now we have talked about the first month, Passover, unleavened bread. 50 days later, almost 2 months, so this would have been sometime in the 3rd month, Feast of First Fruits, or Pentecost. By the way, Pentecost comes from 50, as you know. And then, about 4 months later, the 7th month, the first day, was a solemn rest, a memorial, a blowing of trumpets, and a holy convocation. A burnt offering was to be made on this day to prepare them for the coming holy event. This was the Day of Atonement. So on the 7th month and the 10th day, the Day of Atonement came about. A holy day, no work to be done, or they would be cut off from among the people. The people were to be humbled on this day, or they were to be cut off from among the people. This is the Day of Atonement. This is the day that the priest offers sacrifice for your sin. This is a holy day. Now, we don't have to wait on that every year, do we? We can at any time approach our Father and ask for forgiveness, following repentance, confession of sin. People were to be humbled on this day. This was to be done from the 9th day at evening until the 10th day at evening. So their normal Jewish day, 6 p.m. to 6 p.m., 24-hour period. On the 15th day was the Feast of Tabernacles, and this lasted for 7 days. The first day and the 8th day, Holy Convocation, or days of worship to God. A burnt offering was made for 7 days. They were to take tree fruits, palm branches, boughs of thick trees and willows, and rejoice while dwelling in tents for 7 days to remember their exodus from Egypt. Now, where do the tents come into play? What did they dwell in when they were at the foot of Mount Sinai? Tents. What did they dwell in when they were wandering in the wilderness? Tents. What did they dwell in until they went across the Jordan into Canaan? Tents.
And the temple, the holy temple, was a tent.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, the tabernacle was a tent as well. And so up until this point in time then, the people of Israel had been in tents. And so that first Feast of Tabernacles would have been very interesting from the standpoint that they were really rejoicing in being brought out of Egypt. Right. Rejoicing in living and having their own tent. If you've been a slave all your life and you come out to freedom, you're not really interested in McMansion, are you?
No.
You're just interested in being able to live and sustain your life And what had God done all this time? He had brought them manna. He had brought them quail. Remember, they're still eating that. They're in the wilderness. They're still eating that. So they're dwelling in those tents. And Jehovah said, you remember that. Just as we did not literally see with our eyes the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, we live by faith in that regard. Those that were descendants after they went in of Israel, after they went into the land, observed these things by faith. And sometimes we say, oh, the Old Testament doesn't have anything to do with faith. I beg to differ with you. It had a lot to do with faith. So here they are gathering all these things, and even after they had their own houses, they would make these tents or these shelters, and they would live in them for 7 days to remember their exodus from Egypt. Can you imagine what the nations would say as they looked upon this and they see in the 7th month, he's got a perfectly good house. What's he doing building a shanty out there? They didn't understand. Ken?
The word shanty is very good because God actually told them, don't make it so much that the cold wind doesn't blow in on you at night. It's like, wow.
Yeah. Right. Just like the old days. Just like the old days. And some of you were brought up in the houses where the cold wind blew through at night. You remember those times. Some of us not so much. Some of us get a little weak because of that. Yes, George.
What you were talking about, something my dad told me when he was raised. Now, I didn't live in the house where the wind blew through, but he lived in a house where he could see the chickens through the floor.
Right.
He came up with some, depression times, so that reminded me of that.
I don't want to embarrass anybody, but I think there's a fellow in here today that grew up in a house like that. Any comments or questions about what we've talked about this morning? I know it's a little bit, as some of these other lessons, chapters have been, a little bit difficult to digest all of it. But hopefully we've talked about some application enough that we see when we come together on this day in a holy convocation, holy day of worship, that we have our minds right. We have our minds set on what we're doing. Yes, Dustin?
The thing that strikes me about it is, as we've been reading through the last couple of chapters, is just how complicated all of this truly is. And just, I guess it just strikes me how thankful we should probably be. Our road is much easier versus this. And this didn't even lead to salvation.
Right.
This would only make them clean for a short period of time. It would have to be repeated constantly.
Yeah.
Versus, we never actually have a road to heaven. We come to our Father and pray. We go and we partake of the Lord's service and reverence. We sing songs and give praises to God. We listen and learn and hopefully take the list. Our road is much easier than what they had to go through. It's hard to even try to remember as we're going through it and you get high points and other people have added commentary. I can't even imagine what it would be like trying to live. The last day, 159 animals were offered for the congregation in the 7th month alone. And that is a huge amount of livestock, and that's not even all.
It is.
It's just amazing the limits of all this. I know there was a purpose to it. I question about all this.
Right.
This was a huge undertaking.
It was, no doubt. And I have an acquaintance that says if you do what is hard, life will be easy. If you do what is easy, life will be hard. God spent a lot of time trying to get his people to follow him. He took a people out of Egypt that didn't even know him. A ragtag people, a bunch of slaves. He took them out of Egypt because of his promise to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And he made them his people. And he gave them a law. And they had a tough education. It was a tough education for them because they'd never before seen anything like this. But God led them through the Red Sea. He took care of them in the wilderness. And he gave them this law. And And so when Galatians chapter 3 tells us that the old law was a schoolmaster, I don't think we really understand what he's talking about there. This was a tough education and it was a tough schoolmaster, but it was what God intended his people to follow so that this holy people could come to Christ. I'm just amazed at what our Father's done for us. Thank you so much for your attention this morning.